Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, True Crime and Felines. If you are a returning subscriber, welcome back, my feline friends. If you are new here, my name is Brandy, and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my fabulous felines. Or none, as it has been lately. We'll see how long they stick around. I hope everyone had a great 4th of July. Myself, it was pretty good, but I got injured. If you kind of notice here, kind of see this lovely cut. Fireworks and my dog do not mix. We do not personally let off fireworks, and we just kind of sit with our animals on 4th of July. And the neighbors decided to let off a very loud firework, and the dog took off across my face and back nail caught me, so nice little battle scar. Anyway, this week's case was suggested by a subscriber, Matthew, and this case deals with a mother who probably shouldn't have been a mother at all and has no maternal instinct. So, let's get started. Can you stop, please? Thank you. Theresa Knorr was born March 14th in 1946 in California. Theresa was the youngest in the family and had an older sister named Rosemary. Now, her and Rosemary often fought a lot. Theresa was known to be jealous of Rosemary. Or if they weren't fighting over the local neighbor boy, they were fighting over affections from their mother. Now, Theresa and her family were pretty comfortable until about 1950 when her dad developed Parkinson's disease. Now, he did have surgery on the brain, but it didn't go too well, and he had to end up quitting his job. Hello, Fred. So, Theresa's mother worked while trying to keep the family afloat. Theresa's dad, being sick and unable to work, fell into a depression, and he started taking out his frustrations on the family, which resulted in verbal and some physical abuse. Now, through this, Theresa and her mother would become very close. And some even say that Theresa's mother favorited Theresa over her other daughter, Rosemary. Now, unfortunately, Theresa's mother would die of heart failure in 1961. Theresa and her mother were actually on their way to the store when her mother collapsed right in Theresa's arms, and she watched her mother die. Now, obviously, this was very devastating for Theresa. She was only 16 years old to witness something like this. Excuse the jumping kitties. To make matters worse, because her father could not work, they were no longer able to afford the family home, and so her father had to sell it. Theresa seemed to be losing everything in her life, and so she fell into a depression herself and latched on pretty much to the first guy she came across. Now, during this time, Theresa had been sort of seeing this guy named Clifford, who was 5 years older than her, and she decided to get married. So at age 16, she walked down the aisle. She ended up dropping out of school, and eventually she became pregnant. And in July of 1963, Theresa's first son, Howard, was born. Now, Theresa's marriage to Clifford was a little rocky. Theresa would accuse Clifford of cheating. She would repeatedly accuse him of this, and the couple would constantly fight. In 1964, Theresa and Clifford got into a particularly bad fight, and Theresa would accuse Clifford of actually punching her in the face. Don't be mean. Now, authorities got involved, but when it came down to it, Theresa refused to press charges, so they were dropped. In a few short weeks after this punching incident, Clifford and Theresa got into it again. This time Theresa was mad because it was Clifford's birthday, and he chose to spend it with his friends instead of staying home with her and Howard. Clifford had apparently had enough of Theresa's crap and told her it was over. He had packed a bag, and while he was walking out the door, Theresa would grab a rifle and shoot him. Clifford would die of this shooting. He was 23 years old. Now, Theresa was arrested for Clifford's murder, but she stated that the shooting was self-defense. She claimed that Clifford would get drunk and fly into a violent rage and start beating on her. And she had recently found out that she was pregnant, and so all she was doing was trying to protect her baby. Now, at the trial, despite several witnesses claiming that Clifford was not a violent man, and even Theresa's own sister Rosemary taking the stand, saying that Theresa would kill him before letting him be with another woman, Theresa was actually acquitted of the murder. Many think the jury took pity upon her because she was only 18 years old, pregnant, and had married an older man. So shortly after the trial in March of 1965, Theresa would give birth to her first daughter, Sheila. After Sheila was born, Theresa would start drinking, and she spent a lot of time in the bars. And in one of these events, she met a man named Estelle. Now, Estelle was actually a disabled veteran. He was a quadriplegic, but Theresa didn't care, and they started a relationship. Soon they had moved in together, but the relationship seemed to go south because Theresa would leave her 2 children with Estelle while she went out to the bars drinking and partying. Estelle got fed up with this, and then finally the nail in the coffin was when Estelle found out that Theresa was having an affair with his best friend and ended the relationship. Estelle's best friend was named Robert Knorr, and Theresa had found out shortly after Estelle dumped her that she was pregnant with Robert's baby. So Theresa and Robert got married in 1966. Theresa would end up giving birth to a second daughter, and she named her Susan in September. Now the couple would go on to have 3 more children. William in 1967, Robert Jr. in 1968, and finally Theresa, who they nicknamed Terry, in 1970. Now again, Theresa was a very jealous woman and started accusing Robert of being unfaithful. As just like before, their relationship turned violent. And when Theresa wasn't hitting on her husband Robert, she was taking it out on the children as well. Robert finally filed for divorce, and that divorce was finalized in 1971. Now, after the divorce, Robert attempted several times to see his children, but Theresa had prevented this at every turn. And Robert eventually gave up after he got remarried. The next year, in 1972, Theresa would meet a man named Robert, and they would marry. The marriage did not last long, and that same year, a divorce was finalized. Again, the reason for the divorce was Theresa was leaving all 6 of her children with Robert while she went out and drank and allegedly had affairs. Theresa's final marriage happened in 1976 when she married Chester Harris. Now, Theresa's 3rd child, Susan, actually bonded with Chester because she didn't have a dad, and Chester was a good man. So they would play chess and talk mythology a lot. Well, apparently Theresa didn't like this. She became jealous of Susan and Chester's relationship and would file for divorce. Now, when she filed for divorce, she would claim that Chester had many pictures of nude women all over, and that's the reason why she was filing for divorce. So they were divorced 2 months after they were married. So all through these failed marriages, Theresa's drinking, the children would suffer the most. After her last and final divorce, Theresa really began drinking heavily, and she ended up gaining a lot of weight, which apparently didn't sit well with her, and her temper just flew completely out of control. The children would suffer physical, verbal, and psychological abuse through the years. Theresa would burn them with her cigarettes. She would even throw knives at them to, test her aim, among other terrible things besides just generally beating them. She would also end up pulling all the children out of school, and she kept them indoors and wouldn't let any visitors come over or would not let them go outside. She even ended up disconnecting the phone so she would get no phone calls, and neither would the children. Now, Theresa and her children lived in an apartment, so they had neighbors pretty close by. But since they kept to themselves, the neighbors didn't know much about them. All they said is the kids seemed to be high-strung and paranoid. We know why. And that when they did get a glimpse inside the apartment, it was filthy and smelled really bad. Now, Howard, the oldest child of Theresa, would end up moving out and getting on with his own life and never looking back. He completely cut ties with his mother and the family. However, Theresa seemed to focus more of her anger and frustrations out on her 2 daughters, Susan and Sheila. It was believed that Theresa was jealous of them because they were maturing and becoming young women who were attractive, had nice figure, and Theresa was jealous of that because she was aging, and because of her drinking and smoking, probably looked pretty bad, and she was unhappy about her own weight gain. Theresa would also tell the other children that her daughter Susan was actually a witch because her final husband Chester was in some sort of cult and had bewitched her or something. Now, Susan, in order to get back at her mother for the abuse, would just play into this and tell her mom that she was going to join Chester's cult and come curse her. Unfortunately, this did not bode well for Susan. After one particular really bad session of being beat, Susan would end up running away from home. She was picked up by authorities and they placed her in a psychiatric hospital. Now, Susan did tell the hospital staff while she was there of the abuse that her and her siblings were suffering at the hands of Theresa. However, when Theresa was questioned about this, Theresa, of course, denied the allegations and then told the staff that her daughter had mental issues. So Susan, when she got out of the hospital, was released back to her mother. There was no further investigation. Theresa would end up taking Susan home and handcuffing her to the table and then beating her severely. She even made her other children take turns beating her to, show an example of what happens if you run away from home and tell on your mother. Now, shortly after that, it was 1982, and Theresa had started accusing Susan, of course, of being a witch, but cursing her and making her gain all this weight. Susan would deny the allegations, but Theresa wasn't having it, and she ended up taking a .44 caliber pistol and shooting Susan right into the chest. Now, Susan survived this, and the bullet actually lodged in her back. Theresa, of course, refused to get medical help or call an ambulance and told her sons to just place Susan in the bathtub and whatever happens, happens. Now, Theresa did allow Sheila and Terry to care for their sister, and miraculously, Susan would recover from this. and rejoin the family. 2 years later, in 1984, Theresa and Susan got into another fight where Theresa ended up taking a pair of scissors and stabbing Susan in the back. Now, this was not a fatal wound, but it had convinced Susan that she was just fed up. She was done. At this point, Susan was 18 years old, and she told her mother she's going to move out and leave. Now, surprisingly, Theresa said, "That's fine. You can leave on one condition, that we need to remove the bullet from your back from 2 years ago. So if you decide to tell people again that I abused you, there will be no evidence." She goes, "And once that bullet is removed, you are free to go wherever you want." So Susan reluctantly agreed to this because all she could see was her freedom. So a couple days later, Theresa gave Susan a bunch of pills and a bunch of alcohol until she passed out. She then gave her son, Robert Jr., who was 15 years old at the time, an X-Acto knife, like a box cutter, and told him to dig out the bullet. So he did. The next day, Susan woke up in severe pain. Obviously, something like this would not heal properly, and Susan's wound became infected. Now, Theresa attempted to solve the issue by giving her antibiotics and ibuprofen, but she needed more professional medical treatment, obviously, but Theresa wouldn't allow it. And soon the wound became septic and Susan got jaundice. Her health continued to decline and she became delirious. So on July 16th of 1984, Theresa decided Susan needed to go. So she bound Susan's hands and feet together and put duct tape over her mouth and told her two boys to put Susan into the back of the car. Susan then packed up a lot of Susan's belongings into trash bags, threw them in the car, and they went for a drive. Theresa had told the two boys in the car that Susan's soul was taken by the devil, and in order to purge Satan from her, she needed to be burned. So they found a quiet place kind of in a ditch alongside of the road. They put Susan into the ditch. Theresa brought all of her belongings, placed them beside her, poured lighter fluid all over Susan and her belongings, lit a match, and set everything ablaze. Susan's body was found the following day, and she was classified as a Jane Doe because they had no way of knowing who she was, especially since she hadn't been in school since 8th grade. Her autopsy determined that she was still alive when they lit her on fire. The autopsy also found that there was a tumor on her ovary that developed from a severe beating before she died. The case just went cold and Theresa was in the clear. She was satisfied. Now, with Susan gone, Sheila unfortunately fell in the crosshairs of Theresa. Sheila was now 20 years old, and a lot of people were like, why didn't she just leave? Please realize when you grow up in this environment, first of all, they thought it was normal. One of Sheila's sons later would say that they couldn't watch the Brady Bunch because they were so jealous of that family, and that's not how life really was. They thought what they were in was normal. It's almost like a really screwed up way of a Stockholm syndrome. Plus, we don't know how much brainwashing or what Theresa told her kids. They were very scared. So in 1985, Theresa said the family needed money. Theresa wasn't working and she was actually on welfare or government assistance, but the money wasn't enough. So she told Sheila that she was going to start sleeping with men for money. Now, at first, Sheila wasn't very happy about this idea, but quickly Sheila realized that since she was bringing home hundreds of dollars a week, it pleased her mother, and her mother stopped beating her. And Sheila was also granted access to leave the house whenever she wanted. So in a way, in a weird, screwed up way, this benefited Sheila. However, it would only be a few short weeks later that, Theresa went off the deep end. And what happened is she accused Sheila of contracting a STD, a venereal disease, and passing it on to her mother through the toilet seat. Yeah, Theresa, I'm sure that's how you caught it. So Theresa ended up hog-tying Sheila and throwing her into a small closet with no ventilation and denying her of any food and water. And she told the other children that they were not allowed to ever open that door. Unfortunately, Sheila would die about 3 days later on June 21st, 1985, from starvation and dehydration. If you can imagine being hogtied, stuck in a closet in the California heat with no ventilation, no food, and no water, you're not going to last long. They guessed it was June 21st because that was the last sound they heard coming from the closet, and it would be an additional 3 days later before Theresa would open the closet door and realize that her daughter was dead. Theresa directed her 2 sons, William and Robert, to get rid of Sheila's body because she started decomposing and it started to smell. So the boys put Sheila in a cardboard box with some blankets, and they would drop her off by an airport in a field. Again, the box was found pretty shortly after. Authorities were called, and this was their Jane Doe number 2 because they had no way of identifying who it was. So even though Theresa had the boys remove Sheila's body, the apartment still smelled. And Theresa became concerned about that the neighbors would probably start talking. So she moved the family out one night and then directed Terry, her youngest daughter, to set the apartment ablaze to cover any evidence. Of course, Terry was very scared. She was only 16 years old at the time, so she did what her mother said. She took lighter fluid and doused the apartment and then lit a match and crawled through the side window. Now, what they weren't counting on, though, is the neighbors were really quick to report the fire. Authorities were on their game, got there quickly, doused the fire, and very little damage was done to the apartment. And the closet that smelled so bad, there was no damage at all. And obviously the authorities knew that this apartment was set ablaze on purpose. They ended up finding the closet and getting a lot of evidence from it. And so Theresa decided to go into hiding. Now, due to the confusion and the hurriedness of Theresa going into hiding, this was the opportunity for most of her children to get away from her. William completely cut ties as Howard did years before, and he ended up moving in with a girlfriend. Terry, who had kept her older sister Sheila's ID as a memento, never knew it would come in handy. She looked like Sheila, so she was able to be passed off as 21 years old and get the hell away from Theresa. After escaping from her mother, Terry did call the authorities and reported what had happened with the family, but they dismissed it as fiction. I mean, they figured this story was just too terrible to be true. I mean, what kind of mother would do something like this? Well, Theresa, that's who. Robert, who was 19 years old, would end up staying with his mother, and they would both go into hiding, and eventually they would move to Las Vegas, and they kept a low profile. However, in 1991, Robert was arrested for shooting a bartender in the middle of a robbery, no doubt at the direction of his mother. He was caught and arrested and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Now, Theresa, not wanting to get any heat on her, had left Las Vegas and moved to Salt Lake City, and then took back her maiden name and went by Theresa Cross. In 1993, Terry was still trying to make her mother pay for what she did to her older sisters, and she ended up contacting the California authorities where her sister's bodies were found. This time, they took her claims seriously because her story matched a lot of the autopsy results on these Jane Does. So they put out arrest warrants for Theresa and her 2 sons. Now, William was the easiest to find. He was living in Woodland, California with his now wife in a suburban environment, and he was working, no criminal records. Robert, who was already in jail serving 16 years for shooting the bartender, was also easy to find, and he was charged as well. And finally, on November 10th, 1993, they located Theresa because she had been pulled over 5 days earlier for drunk driving. You think she would have gotten, or at least tried to get clean at this point, but she was taken into custody in Salt Lake City, where she was working as a caretaker for an 86-year-old woman. Theresa was charged with 2 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and murder by torture, which is a special crime charge. And of course, she would plead not guilty. She didn't do it. However, that all changed when Theresa found out that her son, Robert Jr., the one in jail, was willing to testify against her for a reduced sentence and on his role in the murders. And she found out William had already confessed to his role and was going to testify against her as well. So she ended up making a plea deal and stated that if she pled guilty, that the death penalty would then be taken off the table, and the prosecutors agreed. So Theresa was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murder of her daughters, and she is currently incarcerated at the California Institution for Women. She will be eligible for parole in 2027 when she's 80 years old. William was just sentenced to probation and to undergo mandatory therapy. As for Robert, who was already in jail in Vegas, he ended up getting a 3-year sentence for conspiracy after the fact, and all the other charges were dropped. And they agreed that the 3-year sentence could be served concurrently with what he was already serving. Now, as for Terry, the youngest, after she escaped her mother, she had been married twice, and she was living with her second husband in Utah at the time of her mother's arrest. She had no idea her mother lived as close to her as she did, and it was unknown if Theresa knew Terry lived so close either. Now, Terry would pass away in 2011 of heart failure. The interesting fact in this is that after Theresa's conviction, authorities would open an old case from 1983 on Theresa's older sister, Rosemary. Remember her? Well, in 1983, apparently Rosemary was found at the end of a dead-end road, strangled to death. So they opened the investigation to see if Theresa had anything to do with the death of her sister. However, they were unable to prove that Theresa had anything to do with her death. So what are your thoughts on this case? If Theresa survives till 2027, do you think she should be let out? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you would like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back next Friday with another true crime case or mystery. Thanks, guys.